There is a popular idea, especially in self-help circles, that the fastest way to lasting change is to, in quotes, become the person you want to be before you act like them. Decide you are an athlete. Declare yourself disciplined. Affirm the identity. Do these things and the behavior will follow. It's an appealing idea, but it puts the cart before the horse. The psychological evidence points in the opposite direction. Identity is not the input to behavior change, it's the output. You do not act disciplined because you have decided you are a disciplined person. You are a disciplined person because you have acted that way repeatedly, and your brain has registered the evidence. This distinction matters. Getting it backwards does not just slow progress, it can actively undermine it. Hey there, it's me, Core, and you're listening to Exercising Self-Control from Fitness to Flourishing. Here's the premise. Identity isn't what you claim before you act. It's what your actions make undeniable. Choice only becomes real when it's enacted, and your identity is nothing more than the pattern of those enacted choices. Putting it more succinctly with one of my aphorisms, you identify yourself by your choices. You are what you choose to do consistently. The identity-first approach to self-control holds that the key shift is moving from seeing discipline as an activity to seeing it as a core part of who you are. The logic goes like this. Most people approach discipline as a chore, a set of rules you, in quotes, have to follow. When discipline becomes identity, it becomes a standard you hold for yourself, which removes the need for daily internal negotiation. Activity-based, I have to go to the gym today. This requires willpower. It feels like something you'd rather avoid. Identity-based, I am an athlete, and athletes train. This reflects your character. It feels authentic. The appeal is real. An identity-based approach promises reduced decision fatigue, greater consistency, and resistance to excuses. When a behavior is part of who you are, the decision is already made. But there's a problem with this. The identity being described here, the one that makes discipline feel automatic and inevitable, is what I call the conditioned self. This is the self you have trained into existence through repeated choices until those choices require no conscious effort. It's your automatic pilot. The mistake the identity-first approach makes is assuming you can inhabit the conditioned self before you have done the conditioning. The intuition that action must precede identity is not just common sense. It's a formal theory in psychology. Self-perception theory, developed by psychologist Daryl Bem, proposes that when our internal cues are weak or ambiguous, we look at our own behavior to figure out who we are. The process works like this. You observe yourself waking up early, finishing a difficult task, or following through on a commitment. You then conclude, I did that without being forced. I chose to do it. I must be a disciplined person. In this model, identity emerges from what you do rather than directing what you do. This is the foundation of what James Clear calls the voting metaphor in Atomic Habits. Every disciplined action is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. Identity is a lagging indicator. You do not become disciplined by saying you're disciplined. You become it by accumulating enough behavioral evidence that your brain can no longer deny the new self-image. Once that identity is established, it begins to function as a buffer. In moments of low willpower, you act disciplined not because you want to, but because acting otherwise would create cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort of behaving against your own self-image. This is the conditioned self doing its work. Behavior that once required effort now happens automatically, depending only on the circumstances triggering the conditioned response. There is a legitimate counter-argument. If cognitive dissonance is what eventually locks in a disciplined identity, why not deliberately create that dissonance up front by affirming the identity before the behavior exists? This idea has some research support. The hypocrisy paradigm shows that when people publicly affirm a value, for example, I am an honest person, and are then reminded of times they failed to live up to it, the resulting discomfort often drives meaningful behavior change. The gap between stated identity and actual behavior creates a psychological pressure to close it. Claude Steele's self-affirmation theory adds another layer. Affirming a broad sense of identity, I am a person of integrity, for example, can reduce defensiveness, making people more willing to accept uncomfortable truths about their current behavior and take action to address them. fMRI studies show this kind of self-affirmation activates the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a region linked to self-relevance and value in the brain, and that this neural activity predicts real behavior change in the months that follow. So affirmations are not useless. Used well, they function as a preferred self, as I call it. The preferred self is a defined standard of excellence you hold as your personal target, a clear picture of the conditioned self you are working to train. The problem arises when the affirmation is mistaken for the destination rather than used as a compass pointing toward it. When the gap between a merely affirmed identity and actual behavior is too wide, the strategy can backfire in 3 ways. There's the fraud factor. Claiming an identity without behavioral evidence creates psychological stress rather than motivation. If you declare yourself a marathon runner, but have not run, the gap does not create productive tension. It creates a quiet sense of fraudulence that erodes confidence over time. The mind knows the difference between what you have declared and what you have done. It keeps score and renders judgment. Then there's moral licensing. Feeling good by thinking of yourself as a disciplined person can paradoxically give you permission to act otherwise. I'm basically an athlete anyway. I can skip today's workout. The psychological reward comes from the label, not the work, which undermines the intrinsic motivation to actually do it. Then there's the backfire effect. If the dissonance between affirmation and reality becomes too uncomfortable, the mind resolves it not by changing behavior, but by changing the belief. Discipline isn't that important anyway. The identity retreats rather than the behavior advancing. These are not edge cases. They are predictable failure modes of the identity-first approach, and they explain why so many people who, in quotes, decide to change, never do. The psychological weight of evidence favors a bottom-up approach, one where identity is the output of behavior, not the input. To change the conditioned self requires consciously choosing to change. It takes training, practice, and repetition until the new behavior is automatized. That process begins not with a declaration, but with a deliberate choice, made by what I call the choosing self, to act in accordance with a preferred self consistently until the behavior no longer requires conscious effort. 3 mechanisms explain why the behavior must come first. First, there's the evidence-based brain. According to self-signaling theory, we treat our own actions as diagnostic signals of our character. When you force yourself to work for 20 minutes when you're tired, your brain records a data point. I did the work when it was hard. I must be disciplined. One hard-won action is worth more to your self-image than 1,000 unearned affirmations, because the brain cannot easily dismiss lived evidence. Second is avoiding moral licensing. By focusing on execution rather than the label, you remove the psychological reward that comes from the mere idea of being disciplined. There is no conditioned self to rest on yet, only the next choice. This keeps the motivation grounded in the work itself, rather than in a self-concept that can be exploited. And third, there's reduced psychological friction. Leading with identity raises the stakes of every failure. Miss a workout when you claim to be an athlete, and you have not just missed a session. You have failed to be who you said you were. This can trigger a spiral of shame that makes it harder to get back on track. Leading with behavior keeps failure in proportion. You missed a day of work, not a day of being yourself. The choosing self simply makes the next choice. If discipline as identity is the popular framing, a more psychologically accurate one is discipline as identifying. We're shifting from static to active. Identity is a noun, static, something you either have or don't have. Identify is a verb, active, ongoing, evidence-dependent. If you're a word geek like me, I'll add this. Identify comes from late Latin identitas, plus the Latin suffix ficere, which is from facere, the action of doing, making, or creating. Sorry if my Latin pronunciation is way off there. I'd originally been using identification, but after the etymological research, I realized identifying describes exactly what's needed to change one's identity. Identifying acknowledges that your self-image is a deduction, not a declaration. It is built from a paper trail of behavior. Attribution theory holds that we attribute traits to ourselves by observing our own consistency across different situations. The more contexts in which you act with discipline, the stronger the case your brain builds for identifying as disciplined. This framing also guards against two common traps. First, it prevents identity foreclosure, the developmental psychology concept describing what happens when someone commits to an identity without having done the work to earn it. Identifying keeps your self-view grounded in reality rather than aspiration. Second, it accounts for the brain's recency bias. Your self-image is weighted toward what you did recently, not what you did years ago. Identifying must be continually renewed. You are identifying as disciplined today because of the choices you made today. This prevents you from resting on a conditioned self that is no longer being actively maintained. Once identifying is underway, it also becomes a practical decision-making filter. Rather than a rigid, I am this, it becomes a question of alignment. Does this action support my identifying as a disciplined person? Self-control becomes a series of binary choices rather than a vague character struggle. The process then follows a clear sequence. First, action. You do the thing. That's the work. Second, evidence. You notice you did the thing. That's the observation. Third, identifying. You conclude you are the type of person who does that thing. That's the deduction. And finally, fourth, identity. The behavior becomes a baseline expectation. That is the conditioned self. Each stage depends on the one before it. You cannot shortcut to identity without the evidence. You cannot build evidence without the action. And the action begins with a conscious choice. The choosing self guided by a preferred self, training a new conditioned self into existence. The work comes first, always. The idea that you must, in quotes, become someone before you can act like them is seductive. But it inverts the actual psychology of change. Identity is not a starting point. It is a destination, one you reach by accumulating enough behavioral evidence that your brain accepts the new self-image as fact. The conditioned self you want, the one for whom discipline is automatic, effortless, and inevitable, cannot be claimed in advance. It must be trained. That training begins with the choosing self making one deliberate choice, consistent with a preferred self, and then making it again tomorrow. This is why the most durable form of self-control is not a declaration. It is a practice. Not, I am disciplined, but I am in the process of identifying as disciplined. And here are all the disciplined choices I've enacted as evidence. An identity, in the end, is not something you claim. It is something you earn, one action at a time. That's it for today. Catch you next time.